Good evening and welcome to our 2025 Holocaust Memorial Day event online. I'm Professor Charlie Jeffrey, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of York. I think we have lots of people in the virtual room this evening from across the UK and beyond, so thank you for joining us. As the memory of the Holocaust is soon to pass from our living history, we must never allow it to slip from our consciousness. We're deeply honoured to be joined this evening by Dame Stephanie Shirley, who'll be sharing her own experiences and reflections on this important subject. We owe such gratitude to those who have dedicated so much of their lives to sharing these memories with us, and it's our hope that future generations never forget the devastating human cost of the Holocaust. Sadly, though, we live in a world where acts of unspeakable cruelty and violence are still perpetrated against people for no other reason than their religion, their race, or their beliefs. We are horrified at the appalling levels of civilian death, suffering, and devastation, and the continued escalation of violence and war. Our thoughts are with those who have lost family members or friends, who've been taken hostage, or who have family or friends being held hostage, and those who have lost their homes and places of safety. We are a university of sanctuary, and we welcome those who are displaced or seeking refuge. We seek to be a safe place for refugees, asylum seekers, and other people who have been forced to migrate. Our most recent Giving Day in November raised over £70,000 to support our Sanctuary Fund, providing scholarships to asylum-seeking students and supporting human rights defenders. In December, we hosted the Universities of Sanctuary Network Conference here in York, and we heard about some of the innovative actions university communities have taken to deepen their sanctuary work, as we looked at moving beyond a reactive model to find different ways that promote sanctuary beyond moments of crisis. Since 2008, we've welcomed more than 100 human rights defenders to our Centre for Applied Human Rights. These fellows conduct research, benefit from bespoke training, network opportunities, well-being activities, and are able to gain respite from their difficult working environments back home. There's always more that we can do. And by attending this evening, we hope that you will be inspired to further support work in these areas, as well as continuing conversations within your own communities. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Dr. Lisa Peschel, from our School of Arts and Creative Technologies, to chair the event this evening. Thank you. And over to you, Lisa.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Holocaust Memorial Day 2025 Open Lecture, brought to you by the University of York. I'm Lisa Peschel, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this evening's event, in particular because my own research is about the Jews of Central Europe and the cultural life that they established during the Second World War in the Theresienstadt ghetto. Fortunately, Dame Stephanie, also known as Steve, was able to leave Central Europe in time to be spared this fate, and we'll learn more about that shortly. This lecture is part of a program of events taking place during January to mark Holocaust Memorial Day. We are proud to work with the Holocaust Memorial York Steering Group, which is made up of representatives and organizations from across the city. This evening, we are delighted to welcome Steve, Dame Stephanie, and we are grateful to her for sharing her story with us. Steve is a workplace revolutionary and successful IT entrepreneur turned ardent venture philanthropist. She arrived in Britain in 1939 as an unaccompanied 5-year-old Kindertransport refugee, and this experience made her determined to live a life worth saving. Her contributions to her host country are enormous. For example, after facing many challenges during her work as a woman in the field of IT in the 1950s, she started her own software house, Freelance Programmers, and pioneered new flexible work practices that changed the landscape for women working in technology. She went on to create a global business and a personal fortune, which she then shared with her colleagues, making millionaires of 70 of her staff. Since retiring in 1993, Steve's life has been dedicated to venture philanthropy in the fields of IT and autism, donating millions of dollars to each cause. She has also written her memoir titled Let It Go, My Extraordinary Story, From Refugee to Entrepreneur to Philanthropist, and will provide details later for how you can purchase the book or obtain a personally signed copy. This evening, she's agreed to take some questions after her talk, so please do post any thoughts in the Q&A throughout the event, and we'll take some of those questions later. But before she begins her talk, she has asked us to share a work of music that relates to her own early experiences. We'll play an excerpt. This piece by Carl Davis is from The Last Train to Tomorrow, a dramatic narrative for children's choir, actors, and orchestra. This work is based on the story of the Kindertransports, and this particular song features the voices of children like Steve facing an uncertain future.
To England, for the children, there are trains. Trains, there are trains. Trains, there are trains. To England, for the children.
Good evening, Professor Peschel, ladies and gentlemen. It's my privilege to deliver this open lecture to the University of York, as you've heard, designated a university of sanctuary and committed to being a welcoming place for those seeking refuge from war, persecution, and other dangers. The university was established in 1963 as one of the first plate glass universities, known for their modern architecture and innovative approaches to education. But the original petition for it was presented to James I in 1671. The great city of York has a rich and complex history and its own haunting connection to Holocaust Memorial Day. In 1190, Clifford's Towers witnessed the horrific massacre of York's entire Jewish community, 150 people. The many daffodils around the Tower Mound, a species whose six-pointed shape echoes the Star of David, provide an annual memorial around the anniversary of the massacre in mid-March. Although centuries apart, that echoes my talk's themes of persecution and intolerance and reminds us that to have a better future demands that we be vigilant against hatred in all its forms. As you've heard, the music that you've been listening to came from Carl Davis's choral work, Last Train to Tomorrow, composed in 2011 to commemorate the Kindertransport, that remarkable, largely improvised rescue effort which brought thousands of Jewish children from Nazi Europe to Britain in 1938 and 39 to the very brink of war. I was one of them, and today I want to tell you the story of my family in exile. Of course, hundreds and thousands of children never had the chance to make it to safety. They were left behind and later, with their parents and grandparents, faced deportation and near certain death. The Nazis created a regime of systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder worse than any that the world has seen. it killed 2 out of every 3 European Jews, and hundreds of thousands of Roma and Sinti people too. The Nazis called it the final solution. We call it the Holocaust, or Shoah, Hebrew for catastrophe. The candle burns to mark Britain's promise to remember the 6 million who died in the Holocaust. Candles play a part in many different cultures, and their reassuring effect is soothing, and they act as symbols of light amidst the darkness of life. There is a purpose in these ceremonies, in the act of remembering. The Holocaust was the worst genocide in history. One of its lessons is that genocides don't just happen. They only occur when people stand by, afraid to speak out, or worse, when they are indifferent. By remembering the Holocaust, we keep the knowledge of it and the lessons that it can teach us alive in our minds and in our wider discourse. Our world today is full of refugees, migrants, asylum seekers fleeing war, civil unrest, poverty, or the effects of climate change. And this open lecture offers a chance not just to remember those who died in the Nazi genocide, but to think about all those suffering today, the fear and anxiety that goes along with displacement, with being forced to abandon one home and, if you're lucky, to make a new home somewhere else. A refugee asked recently what home meant to them, quoted from a poem by Robert Frost. Home is where, when you go there, they have to let you in. Such a sad remark. The number of the dead is not the sole measure of the Jewish tragedy. I shall tell the personal stories of my secular Jewish father, Gentile mother, and my sister and I, offensively called crossbreeds, who all came to Britain as exiles in 1939 and survived. I am one of the few still alive to bear witness to that dreadful time. And you, therefore, are the very last generation to hear these stories firsthand. And as the so-called Third Reich slips from human memory, I join in Britain's promise to remember, not to forget. And I distinguish between forgetting and forgiving. We started off a respectable German family in Dortmund, which lies bang in the center of Europe. The 4 of us lived in a nice house in a fashionable part of the city, and my elder sister, Renata, went to school with the children of other prosperous bourgeois families. We never know what life holds for us. If all had gone according to plan, we would have remained in that comfortable world indefinitely. But the shadows had been gathering since shortly before my birth in 1933, and it was not a good time to be Jewish. My father, Arnold Buchdahl, was a young judge, a brilliant but rather distant man with a single-minded devotion to principle that was slightly unworldly. I have a vivid early memory of going for a family walk in one of Dortmund's famous parks and stamping, for some reason, on a beetle. My father exploded into a blazing fury How would you like it if a great big foot came down and stamped on you, he shouted. It was an extraordinary rage to direct at a mere toddler. Yet he did get his point through to me. My ethical compass certainly stems from him. In 1933, he was fired by edict of the Third Reich because of his Jewish ethnicity. Again and again, the family was forced to move from city to city and eventually from country to country in search of work and security. We eventually settled in Vienna, my mother's home city. And when the Nazi plague infected Austria as well, the writing was on the wall for anyone who dared to read it. Jewish families who stayed in Central Europe faced catastrophe. One of my clearest recollections of that time is of walking with my mother to fetch my sisters from school. I particularly remember part of the route going along a huge stone wall. I discovered two things about this memory when I revisited the city a few years after the war. First, the wall wasn't huge at all. It was I who had been small. More important was a reason why we always went to collect her. It was because, even as a child, Renata was beginning to suffer from anti-Semitism. She was lucky to have a kind teacher who used to let her out early so that she could get home under our escort without having "dirty Jew" shouted or stones thrown at her by her fellow pupils. It was my father who first faced up to the unthinkable reality that the once solid social framework in which our lives had been built had collapsed, leaving a choice between escape or eventual extinction. It was to be a descent into barbarism. By 1939, the borders were gradually closing. When my parents heard about the Kindertransport, they made the desperate decision that my sister and I should be sent to England into the arms of strangers in order to save our lives. The Kindertransport organized its trains from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Free City of Danzig. Each train had about 1,000 children aged 5 to 16. Some short 17-year-olds also snuck in, with just 2 adults. There were also some girls aged 16 plus caring for babies. Of course, I didn't know at the time that they had volunteered to travel under a concession dependent on their return to what they must have known was almost certain death. Courage takes many forms, and I always salute the sheer heroism of those young carers. And recently learnt of one of them, Lily Reichenfeld, who made 2 such journeys of loving kindness and honoured the guarantee given by a non-Jewish friend. Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and oblivion followed. Let me thank the Jewish and Christian activists who set up the Kindertransport, the Quaker Society of Friends who kept it going when it ran out of money, and the many volunteers who administered that largest ever recorded migration of children. But it was not a simple matter. Forms had to be filled in, documents stamped, permits queued for, at times seemingly deliberately inconvenient times, guarantees provided. Renata and I spent several weeks in a children's home so that my mother could devote herself full time to grappling with the obstacles of Nazi and British bureaucracy. As time ran out, people started to forge Home Office entry permits. No limit to the permitted number of children to be rescued was ever publicly announced. Britain capped its number at 10,000. Compare that with the number of refugees Britain talks about admitting today. While some children had to go into hostels, the refugee children's movement had found Renata and me foster parents in England who were prepared to prepay our future repatriation costs, about £5,000 in today's currency, and to guarantee that the two of us would not be a burden on the state. Thank you, Guy and Ruby Smith. Let me honour them. We call them Uncle and Auntie. They nurtured us as they would their own children, and certainly I am their child in all but birth. Everyone told me to be grateful. Indeed, I am grateful, but also loved them dearly, cared for them in their old age, and honour their memories, as I do all the uncles and aunties who helped us children through those terrible times. The fact that people I did not know saved us by doing what selfless, generous people do made a deep impression. We progressed from being classed as enemy aliens to, once somebody realized we were children, friendly enemy aliens, and post-war to just friendly alien. And the shifting identity captures hate and happiness, villainous and villains and good guys, the fifth columnist or suspected terrorist, the refugee, the unwanted migrant, the asylum seeker, all present a useful outlet for people's fears. We were doubly lucky, trebly lucky, in that unlike most of the parents who sent their children away on the Kindertransport, ours survived. Though sadly, I never really bonded with them again. Moving then to Greta, my Austrian mother, she was the younger daughter of an established Gentile family who'd educated her to be a wife from a middle-income family. Although my father wrote in 1940 that he feared my mother was lost, a euphemism used in front of children, she managed her own desperate escape to England by train, bribing her way across Europe at one vital stage with the coat she was wearing. What happened to her when she finally got to England, penniless and homeless, 4 days before war was declared? The regulations were such that she was only allowed to work in agriculture or domestic service. She chose the latter and cleaned somebody else's nice house before moving after some years to be resident cook for a hostel of 40 schoolgirls. In 1951, she and I went through the naturalization process together. When the interview asked for her views on the 1948 partition of Israel, my mother paused before replying, "I think Britain behaved disgracefully. But this has always been a country of free speech, and we were granted citizenship. I was registered as a British minor, and it was my mother who took the oath of allegiance in front of a justice of the peace. I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King George VI, his heirs and successors, according to law. To further ease our integration, we took the opportunity to anglicize our names and chose Brooke to honour that most English of poets, Rupert Brooke. I found that name change empowering. One summer, my mother and I went to Vienna together, partly for her to search for family and friends, partly to dig up the silver which had been buried for safety. We made a grim train journey across Europe, weighed down with emotional baggage and expectation, before finally emerging in the glorious historic city from which we'd escaped 20 years earlier. I was accosted kindly by a couple who asked, "Excuse us, are you from the camps?" Vienna had not seen a Jewish face for some time. I looked around at its gracious avenues, ancient walls, grand palaces, and elegant squares. While previously I'd wept sentimentally on hearing Viennese music, now I realized in an instant that, lovely as it all was, the city meant nothing to me, and felt the weight of my past diminish. Was my mother happy? I remember her inconsolable tears when one of her few items from the past got broken. Her will asked us to scatter her ashes in the Vienna woods, which says a lot about how she felt about her long exile. My main memory of that filial visit is of my sister's preoccupation with evaluating the likely role of people we saw in the streets who would have been adults in the 1930s. What were you doing when they were throwing stones at me? Going back to my father, the Jewish one of the family, so necessarily the first to escape, having walked over the mountains to neutral Switzerland, and thence by train and ferry to England, he finished the war wearing a British Army uniform, which he'd acquired after a painful journey, literally round the world. There had been widespread failure to differentiate the genuine refugees from Nazis. And as an adult male German refugee, my father had been briefly interned before being deported in July 1940 to Australia. He went from Liverpool on the transport ship Dunera. They were guarded by soldiers on light duty after being shell-shocked at Dunkirk. In any event, they ran amok, locked the internees below deck for most of the 58-day voyage to Sydney, stole their valuables, and threw their suitcases overboard. The conditions on the grossly overcrowded voyage were so appalling that, to Britain's everlasting credit, Parliament found time in the midst of the war to debate the scandal. Those deportees who survived the journey, 2 died and more than 50 had to be hospitalised, then travelled to an internment camp in Hay, New South Wales, so in the middle of an inhospitable nowhere that the high security fence was almost unnecessary. The largely professional inmates made the best of their plight, printing their own money, creating their own system of law and order. My father served again as a judge, and developing not merely a cafe society, but also an unofficial university with a range of educational and cultural programs concerts, and much else. By May 1941, partly as the result of the outcry in Britain as families heard, despite all mail being censored, about the iniquity of their treatment, a substantial number of internees were released to join the Pioneer Corps. My father was among them. His release papers formally recorded his personal effects as nil. And so he found himself once again in the UK. The Pioneer Corps was a relatively new auxiliary force dubbed the King's most loyal enemy alien, which provided backup work for the conventional armed forces. He started off digging ditches and such like. He was later transferred to head what became the Mid Wales Psychiatric Hospital, which was used to treat several hundred mentally ill prisoners of war. My father used a pseudonym so that German patients would not know his original nationality. And some VIP visitors were surprised to meet a lowly staff sergeant in such a responsible role. But apparently, that was then the highest rank permitted to a non-Brit. Amazingly, after his travels, his 1933 dismissal letter, one short paragraph officiously rubber-stamped, was found among his papers when he died. Hitler had taken nationality away from Jewish families, so we'd all arrived stateless, but received some modicum of paperwork from Britain, formally acknowledging that we were displaced persons resident here. This was the so-called Nansen passport. I've always admired the polar explorer Nansen, who became such an effective diplomat and humanitarian. How glad I was to later get my British passport, with its reassurance that His Britannic Majesty's Secretary of State requests and requires, in the name of His Majesty, all those whom it may concern to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance, and to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary. If you've travelled on a stateless passport, you'll know how important that was. To a certain extent, we became just like another group of evacuees. Starting August 1939, the 3.5 million Brits, mainly children, evacuated into safety from areas of danger. My image of wartime Britain is of a quiet country where even outsiders like me could be confident that those in authority would generally do their best to do the right thing by us. After the war, my parents were free, in theory, to return to the homeland from which they'd been driven 6 years earlier. My father was desperate to rebuild his legal career in Germany. To move permanently to England would mean giving up the career dreams that defined him. My mother saw it differently. She had had a world in Germany, a life of comfort, status, and material security. And bit by bit, it had been stolen from her. Perhaps some of her very identity had been stolen with it. Having escaped with her life and little else, it was unthinkable to her that her husband should do anything but build a new life from scratch in England, just as she had done. The outcome was, to modern eyes, predictable. They divorced, and my father returned to Germany more or less immediately. Germany had entirely broken down. The contrast to the orderly societies of Britain couldn't have been stronger or more nightmarish. There was no money, no gas, electricity, no clean water. The only semblance of civil structure was the crude military authority of the occupying Allies. People were living in the cellars of ruined buildings, bartering sex for food to survive, and using cigarettes as currency. Black marketeer, white slaver, there was no warmth in anyone's faces. Most were just blank from hunger and fear. I had lived through 6 years of the most devastating war in human history, but this was my first glimpse of its utter dehumanizing horror and destruction. And I am reminded of that when I see pictures of the rubble that is Gaza. Shortly before the German surrender, my father had left the Pioneer Corps, collected his demob suit, and transferred into the American Army of Occupation, which needed educated German speakers to help with the post-war administration of what remained of the country. He was employed as a junior researcher, but at least from his point of view, it was a step back into the world he understood, especially when mechanisms began to be put up for putting Nazi war criminals on trial. He worked at the Nuremberg trials on the role Adolf Eichmann had played at the infamous Wannsee conference, at which the final solution was agreed. At one point, my father was called upon to give expert evidence on the precise linguistic nuances of the phrase Polish subhumanity and its use in German legal circles in the 1930s. Let me now focus on the shared Kindertransport experience of we two sisters. Me at age 5, clutching the hand of my 9-year-old sister. It's hard after all these years to be certain how many of the remembered details of the 2.5-day journey are real and how much I've added to my mental picture from other sources. Was the July weather outside really grey? Or have I just seen too many black and white photographs of the Kindertransport? I have read that some of the trains were sealed. But surely one boy in our carriage kept getting off to be sick during the train's many unscheduled stops. Or was that just a dream? I'm pretty certain that we slept on large strips of corrugated cardboard, on the floor, as well as on the long wooden benches that lined the sides of the carriages. I believe that at some point in the train journey, the children also slept on overhead luggage racks, though the scene in my mind's eye is different from the archive carriage photographs I have since seen. I presume that I slept too, but I cannot remember doing so. I think my mother had given us food for the journey, but again, I may be wrong. I remember the occasional frightening interruptions from uniformed guards. Nasty they were. I recall vividly the cold, oily smell of the sea, an entirely new experience when we eventually reached the channel at the Hook of Holland. And I vaguely remember the nauseous night crossing to Harwich. But what about my sense that when we finally arrived by train at London's Liverpool Street Station, the platform was silent? Silent. It seemed somehow implausible. And perhaps I've merely projected the numbness of my emotions onto the past. Nonetheless, that is how my mind has preserved it. Hundreds of children spilling out onto the platform, speechless and wide-eyed. We had numbered labels hanging round our necks as if we were lost property. In a sense, we were. Renata also had an expensive Leica slung round her person, to be later sold, of course, because one was permitted to bring out a camera, but effectively no money. We waited to be claimed, sitting on straw-filled mattresses in a cavernous hall. There were two Kindertransport memorial statues at Liverpool Street Station, the smaller one of a young boy with a suitcase by Flor Kent, and the other of a group of child refugees by Frank Meisler, who was himself one of those saved. The 206 plaque, the 2006 plaque, dedicated by the Association of Jewish Refugees, reads formally, "In gratitude to the people of Britain for saving the lives of 10,000 unaccompanied, mainly Jewish children who fled from Nazi persecution in 1938 and 39." And quotes the sacred Talmud, "Whoever rescues a single soul is credited as though they had saved the whole world." Harwich's important role in the Kindertransport was recognised when in 2022 I unveiled, on a terribly windy day, a beautiful memorial on the quayside. And may Ian Walter's sculpture, Safe Haven it's called, stimulate the next generation to learn about the Kindertransport and to support today's child refugees. Britain was one of the very few countries who'd allowed us refugee children in 1939. What have we contributed in return? My sister Renata never settled as well as I did and remained an exile in spirit. When she was 18, she declined several Home Office invitations to apply for British citizenship, until its final letter suggested that if she did not wish to become British, then, by implication, she should go back to where she came from. And that she certainly did not wish to do. She emigrated to Australia on a £10 assisted passage and applied for her Australian citizenship after only 6 months. I've often thought about that. We didn't choose to come to Britain. The exile was done to us, children. As now an adult, Renata had ceased to be a victim and could make things happen rather than have things happen to her. She chose Australia and, having requalified there, contributed significantly to its childcare practices, sublimating the trauma of her own childhood by helping children, including many of the Vietnamese boat children, into adoptive and foster families. Married to an Australian, she adopted a baby girl and fostered 2 brothers, just as we 2 sisters had been fostered a generation back. As for me, I was now a British citizen, and at 18 started in the family tradition of public service, later to go into business to get round all the gender issues of the time. Like many refugees, migrants, and exiles, I have an uncommon level of drive and determination, and I choose to contribute to the society in which I live. Thus, my childhood trauma was transformed into entrepreneurship. I was a late pioneer of computing and a pathfinder in the professionalization of women. an entrepreneur in the early 1960s, sharing ownership with the staff. When the company was acquired after 45 years, it was a public company in the FTSE 250, employing over 8,000 people. And I'm a strategic giver away of my self-made wealth. Germany has made impressive efforts to come to terms with its Nazi past. As one of the estimated 1,000 Kindertransportees still alive worldwide, Germany made 4 recent reparation payments to me. I am no longer in need, so gave the payments to the Safe Passage charity, which helps today's child refugees from Europe. Let me come to my conclusion. A salutary measure I came across recently was that 1 week of conflict requires an estimated 10 years of reconciliation and compromise. 1 week, 10 years. It would have been good to be able to say that the exile of our nuclear family led to a vibrant new dynasty in Britain. But not one of us refreshed the gene pool. My father resettled in the land of his birth. My sister migrated to Australia. My mother and I remained here, although she would have scored high on any measure of nostalgia and never understood the British sense of humour. My only child died without issue. The history of the Holocaust is a fearful one, but where there are shadows, there must be light. So let us finish by remembering the many beautiful stories from those terrible times. Not only the Kindertransport, but also other escapes, such as the 600 children saved by Sir Nicholas Winton from German-occupied Czechoslovakia, and the 300 children who'd somehow survived in concentration camps, who were brought to England in 1945, the so-called Windermere children, to be later integrated into British society, and the 20 Kindertransport girls from Percy Park in Teignmouth, and the 180 ultra-Orthodox Kindertransport boys who found safe haven in a castle in Wales and trained in agriculture to prepare for their future life on a religious kibbutz in Israel. It is now 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. As part of Britain's promise to remember, we honour all victims of Nazi persecution and of the more recent genocides. The role of Holocaust Memorial Day is to commemorate the past and work towards a better future. Let our words and deeds be of love for our neighbours, respecting and cherishing our differences. Thank you.
Dame Stephanie, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. And as people put their questions into the chat, I'll just say a few more things, just a few things that you were too modest to mention. I would like our audience to know, for example, again, Dame Stephanie has contributed so much to her host country. For example, in 2013, she was named by Woman's Hour as one of the 100 most powerful women in Britain. In 2014, the Science Council listed her as one of the top 100 practicing scientists in the UK. Her 2015 TED Talk has over 2.2 million views on YouTube. And in 2017, she received the Order of the Companion of Honor for her services to the IT industry and philanthropy. And this order is limited to only 65 individuals worldwide at any one time. In 2019, the paperback version of her memoir was published, Let It Go, My Extraordinary Story from Refugee to Entrepreneur to Philanthropist. And you can purchase it from our independent bookstore partner, Fox Lane Books. Dame Stephanie is happy to personally sign copies if people will email her PA lynn@steveshirley.com. And this information will all go up in the chat, so you'll be able to see this information. But we do have several questions that people have sent through, and fortunately, Dame Stephanie will spend a little bit of time answering them. There are many, many votes of thanks that come through, and I would like to add my own thanks to you. But I'll share the first question. What lessons should we carry forth from the Holocaust to counter the myth of, quote, the fifth column in society? So viewing refugees as some kind of threat to our society.
I think I mentioned that the term refugee, asylum seeker, they're all misused in a negative sense. I don't have much comment to make on the particular term you used, but one should be conscious that we're using words in a very sensitive way. And when we refer to refugees, it should be in a positive way, that people are seeking refuge, that we are going to help them, that life cannot go on so badly for them. Some of the stories that I know of today's refugees are horrendous, and we have to learn as a society to welcome strangers, to cherish the differences between us, and look forward rather than backward.
Thank you. And I'm very proud that York is a sanctuary city, and this notion of providing refuge, not just to reinforce our own humanity, but the many contributions that people who come to this country bring. Another question that someone asks is, what education were you offered on coming to England?
My foster parents sent me to the local village school, where I spent, I think, 2 or 3 terms, but began to pick up a Birmingham accent. And my foster parents, whom I love dearly, as you may have picked up, were a bit snobby, and they didn't want a child of theirs to be speaking with a Birmingham accent. So they took me out of the school and sent me to a little Roman Catholic convent, which was absolutely marvelous, wonderful values, a very happy period, and good teaching, but by lay nuns, and they were nuns in habits. They were sufficiently professional to say to my foster parents that it looked as if I was gifted in mathematics and should be sit for a scholarship somewhere. In those days, secondary education was not free. And so I did sit for, and I got a scholarship, including travel time and books and everything else. So that saw me through that. I changed school once at the secondary school level, just because of family pressures. But I really had a wonderful education, and can look back with great pleasure. When it came to tertiary education, I was sick and tired of being short of money, and I could not face so many years of studying on a part-time basis. So I studied evening classes for 6 years, and then called it a day at a bachelor's degree in mathematics. I love mathematics. I can't do it anymore, but it has a beauty that is very special to me, and I suppose comes out in my computing industry experiences. Mathematics is the international language of the world, and perhaps we should remember that in this context.
Yeah, we have many, many more questions, so I'll bring a few more in from our audience. When you returned to Austria with your mother, did you find relatives, any news, the silver that you were looking for? What did you find when you returned?
My mother found one family friend and was able to remake contact. We did find the silver. I mean, we knew where it was buried in the garden, and we dug it up and took it home. It was fairly common to hide valuables in this way. Other people gave valuables to neighbors, thinking that would be safe, but it proved not to be so. The thought of putting your valuables in the earth seems so strange in a peaceful, well, sort of peaceful 2025. But it was quite common in those days to hide one's valuables.
So I find that absolutely remarkable that you were able to recover just even a few of those items. Because yeah, as you say, so many of the stories of entrusting valuables to friends have turned out very tragically. Another question, what is your advice for anyone trying to find resilience today?
Resilience comes from practice. The more you are able to cope with change, the easier it becomes the next time. And so I always think my Kindertransport experience has given me an advantage. I had this enormous change at the age of 5, and nothing in life has compared with that. New family, new food, new language, new nationality, not that I was interested in that. I also had the feeling that, let's try again. I began at the age of about 6 to hear too many comments to me. Aren't you lucky to be saved? Aren't you lucky to be saved? That's not a healthy thing to say to a 6-year-old, but it's left me with that need, crying need to make the life that was saved, to lead a life that was worth saving. It's also left me as a patriot. I'm not political at all, but I am a patriot. I love this country with a passion that perhaps only someone who had lost their human rights can feel.
One of our audience members writes, your biological parents are true heroes. And she writes, as a mother of young children, I can hardly begin to process the situation and the choice that they had to make. And I have to say, I am personally so touched by the story of your parents probably knowing that in some ways they were sacrificing not just their present with you, but their future relationship with you. And then the incredible kindness and willingness to take the financial risk that Frank and Ruby Smith, this incredible generosity to you. So you really have these two very impressive.
I'm a very lucky woman.
Yeah. One of the other questions is, one of our audience members wonders, did you or your family members ever consider moving to Israel?
None of the family considered moving to Israel because none of us are actually Jewish by religion. We're secular Jews and proud of it, but the religion means nothing to us.
There are many votes of thanks coming through. Another question, is there something you would highlight from your story that you would teach children in schools?
I think it's what I would highlight from a life's history is that simple, be kind. If you're kind to each other, kind to yourself, then that world becomes more bearable.
And another question asking your advice, a guest writes, throughout your trailblazing career in technology and philanthropy, you've broken numerous barriers as a woman in a male-dominated industry. What advice would you give to young women today who are navigating similar challenges in STEM fields?
Well, from the point of view of careers, it's the same advice that I would give to young men, to find something in life that really interests you, to get trained in it, and make sure that your professional career stays within the bounds of where you're happy and where you're competent. As for happiness, that is something that we all search for and seek, but it's not necessarily to be given.
And another, so many people are asking for advice from you. I'll share another request for advice. The guest writes, my husband has an MBE for his work preventing homelessness. So he is dedicated to spending his life helping vulnerable people. Is there one piece of advice you can offer him to help others, or is there a piece of literature or art that brought you comfort in times of darkness?
That's a wonderful question. I think music brings me comfort.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything about music. I haven't been trained or anything, but sorrow seems to be lifted by music. Happiness seems to be accelerated with music. That's always been very helpful to me. Perhaps you could repeat the question. I'll have another go at it.
Yeah. It was really, I think you did largely answer it, but yeah, the question of any recommendations or specific works that brought you comfort, any specific works of music or art?
I am now a collector of abstract art. You can't see we're in my study, but every wall is covered with lovely, beautiful pictures. They give me enormous pleasure. They give me serenity. I see new things in them every time I look, and that's a feature of abstraction. I can hang them upside down and they're still beautiful. So to me, art is very useful. I once tried to paint and found that my easel, not my easel, but the thing you hold it, my palette was more beautiful than the painting that I'd attempted. So I have no skill in that sense myself, but I can really, really appreciate it in others.
I do wish that we could see your collection. I wish we could see the artworks that you're speaking of. Could you say, this is a question from me, could you say a few words about the piece of music that you played for us at the beginning, this piece of music about the Kindertransports?
It is a choral work by Carl Davis, and it's a full-length choral work, 3 acts and so on. The bit that I always play, because it's so evocative, is the children hearing rumours of their trains, because it wasn't a big announcement on the station, there will be a train on such and such a day. It was all by rumour and mouth to mouth. When it's played, I still find myself in tears, simply because it was such a wonderful project. 10,000 children saved from the Holocaust, quite something. And one should never forget those beautiful stories as we remember. Last night I watched the Shoah film, and I had about 4 hours of most. I was just exhausted, like a wet rag afterwards. And I realized you must concentrate always on the positive.
I think that might be a really beautiful place to end, if you don't mind, or would you like to take a few more questions?
I think it would be a very appropriate finish, actually.
Yes, that was thank you very much for those. Thank you for taking all these questions. Thank you very much for this final comment. And again, for your fascinating talk. And many thanks to everyone who joined us online. So please do visit the website, steveshirley.com, to read more about Steve's work. And I do want to say one more time, her book, Let It Go, My Extraordinary Story, is available from our partner booksellers, foxlanebooks.co.uk. So we hope this event has inspired you, as I know it has inspired me. And please accept my personal thanks. I'm so glad I was able to be here tonight with you. So everyone listening, I hope you'll discuss this evening with your own families and communities. Many thanks and good night.